Della Ashby set her basket of dried yarrow and willow bark on the church supper table. And one by one, the women of Harmon's crossing carried their plates to the other end. They did not say a word. They did not have to. She watched the space around her grow, and she did not leave. She folded her hands. She waited. A week later, at the autumn social, the druggist Elias Crane lifted one of her poultice jars for 40 townsfolk to see. And he laughed. "Granny cures," he said. "Kitchen superstition. Folks, buy your medicine from a man who reads, not weeds from a widow who guesses." And the crowd laughed with him. Nobody in that town ever asked what a woman like Della had done before the war took her Tom. On her high shelf sat a worn leather bag, brass clasp gone dark, 2 letters pressed into the hide. Tom's old bag, folks figured, and Della never said otherwise. They were about to find out the hard way. If you believe respect is earned in silence, this story is for you. Before we go on, subscribe and comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels tonight. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. Harmon's Crossing sat in the Ozark Hills in the fall of 1919. It was a small place, a church, a general store, a bank the size of a shed, a druggist's counter with a brass till. Corn stood brown in the fields, and the maples had gone to fire on the ridges. It was pretty country. Hard, but pretty. Della had come there the autumn before. She came as a stranger. She came as the widow of a man the town had known as a boy. Corporal Thomas Ashby, gone in 1918. Not on the field, they said. In a hospital, of the fever that took so many of the soldiers before they ever saw France. His people were from here. His mother was buried on the hill. So Della came to bury what was left of that life, and to be near his stone, and to be let alone. She was 49 years old. She had gray coming in at her temples. She wore plain dark dresses and an apron with old stains that no washing would lift. Her hands were not soft hands. They were working hands, quick and sure, and there was something in them that a body noticed without knowing what it noticed. She took the old Ferris cabin at the edge of town. It leaned a little. The chimney smoked wrong until she fixed it herself, up on the roof in a man's coat, and 2 women passing on the road stopped to stare at that. She kept a garden. Not a flower garden. She grew things in rows a person could not name. Bitter things, root things. She dried them in bunches from the rafters until the whole cabin smelled green and strange. And she healed people. That was the thing. She never asked to. She never charged a cent. But when the Dooley baby ran a fever so high the mother thought it would take him, it was Della who came in the night and sat with him and brought it down by morning. Cool cloths. A bitter tea in a spoon, drop by drop. Windows open when everyone said close them. And the baby lived. When old man Pruitt cut his leg to the bone on a plow blade, and it went hot and red and started to stink, the doctor was 3 days off and might as well have been on the moon. It was Della who cleaned it out, who packed it with something from a jar, who came back every day until the red went down and the leg was saved. Pruitt kept that leg. He walked on it to church every Sunday, and at church he sat with the men who would not meet her eyes. That was how it went. The town took her help. And the town kept her out. She was the granny woman. That was her name to them. Not Mrs. Ashby, not the widow Ashby even, the granny woman up at the Ferris place, with her weeds and her jars. Useful in the dark. Invisible in the light. You would think that would wear on a soul. Maybe it did. But you would never have seen it. Della said little. She said less than any grown person you ever met. When a woman came to her door with a sick child and a frightened face, Della did not scold and did not preach. She got her bag of dried things. She went. She did the work. And when it was done, she went home and closed her door. And the town went back to pretending she was not there. I want you to understand that before you hear the rest. Before the cruelty. I want you to know that the audience, you and me both, we already liked her. Her calm, her decency, the way she asked for nothing. Hold on to that, because now the town is going to show you who it is. It started, as these things do, with the Ladies' Aid. The Ladies' Aid Society ran Harmon's Crossing the way a rudder runs a boat. Quiet, underneath, but it turned everything, and the president of the Ladies' Aid was Verna Sloan. Verna was a handsome woman of 60, silver hair pinned hard, a brooch at her throat that had been her mother's. She had buried a husband and raised a son and buried him too, and she had a granddaughter now, little Clara, 6 years old, the light of her whole life. Verna guarded that child, and she guarded the town with the same fierce, narrow love. She believed in respectability the way other people believed in God. She believed a place was only as good as the line it drew between the decent and the not. And Della Ashby was on the wrong side of that line. Verna had decided it the first month. A widow who climbed on her own roof, who grew heathen plants, who came and went in the night to other people's houses without a husband, without a word, without asking anyone's leave. It was not proper. It could not be sorted. And what Verna could not sort, Verna shut out. So Della's name never made the lists. When the aide took a covered dish to a new mother, no one thought to tell Della. When they made up the roster for the harvest supper, her name simply was not on it. Nobody voted her out. That was the cruelty of it. There was nothing to vote on. She was just never in. The church supper came in the second week of October. Everyone came to the church supper. It was the whole town under one long roof, tables end to end, hams and pies and jars of beans, lamps hung on wires. Children ran under the tables. It was the warmest night of the year. And Della came, because she had been told, once, by the pastor's kind and useless wife, that all were welcome. All were welcome. So Della came, and she brought what she had, which was a basket of dried yarrow and willow bark, medicine for the winter, set out in case any soul had need of it. She set it on the table. She sat down. And the women moved. It was not loud. Nothing about it was loud. A woman a few seats down gathered her plate and her cup and rose, as if she'd only just seen a friend at the far end. And another followed. And a mother took her 2 children by the shoulders and steered them away. In the space of a minute, the whole middle of that long table had emptied out around Della Ashby, and she sat in a little island of clean, bare boards, alone, with her basket of medicine in front of her. She did not get up. She did not flush or fumble. She folded her hands in her lap, and she waited, the way you wait out weather. Down the table, Verna Sloan did not so much as look. That was the message. You are here, and you are nothing, and we will not even trouble ourselves to see you. Now, here is a thing most folks in that room missed. Earlier that same evening, before the supper, a boy had come running with a hand wrapped in a rag. He'd caught it on a barbed fence, and it was bleeding through. His mother was flustered and far off. And Della, before anyone thought to send for anything, had taken the boy's hand and taken a strip of clean cloth and wound it 3 turns, quick, one-handed, tucked and tight. The bleeding stopped. The whole thing done in the time it takes to tell it. The boy's mother had watched. And something had flickered behind her eyes. Something in how those hands moved. Too practiced. Too fast. Not the way you'd learn tending a garden. But then the supper bell rang, and the moment passed, and she forgot it. They always forgot it. So Della sat alone at the church supper, and she looked, once, up and along that table at the backs of her neighbors. And then she gathered her basket, and she rose, and she walked out into the October dark, and she went home. And she did not cry, as far as anyone knew. She banked her fire. She set her basket on the table. And she looked up, for a moment, at the leather bag on the high shelf. The brass clasp caught the last of the lamplight. 2 letters. T. A. Then she went to bed. The autumn social came at month's end. And that was where Elias Crane made his name at her expense. You have to know Crane to understand it. He was the druggist. He had a real store, with a real glass counter and a wall of little drawers with Latin words painted on them. He had a license framed on the wall. He sat on the town health board. And he sold, above all else, a thing called Crane's Golden Grippy Tonic. 75 cents a bottle. Good, the label swore. For grip and ag and catarrh and low blood and a dozen other complaints. It was mostly grain alcohol and quinine and a little sugar. It made a sick man feel warm and loose and sure he was mending, right up until he wasn't. Crane sold a great deal of it. It was the best thing he had. And here is what stuck in Elias Crane's throat like a fishbone. Della Ashby gave her medicine away. For nothing. And it worked. Every time the granny woman broke a fever with a cup of bitter tea, that was a bottle of Golden Grippy Tonic that did not get sold. She was not just strange to him. She was competition. She was a hole in his till. And a man like Crane could not abide that a widow with a garden was quietly making him look like what he was. So at the autumn social, in the Grange Hall, with the fiddles put by and the tables cleared and 40 of his neighbors gathered, Elias Crane decided to settle it. Della had left a few jars on a side table, salve for chapped hands, a poultice for the chest, free, as always, for whoever had need. Crane walked over and picked one up. He held it high, turned it in the lamplight, and made a face at it, a big face, for the back of the room. "Now what have we here?" he said, loud, "a granny cure." A few people laughed, just to be polite. He liked that. He went on. Kitchen superstition, friends, mud and weeds and God knows what, scraped out of a widow's yard and called physic. He set the jar down like it might dirty him. "I'll tell you what I believe. I believe in science. I believe in the pharmacopoeia. I believe in medicine made clean, by men who studied, and bottled honest, and sold at a fair price." He patted his breast pocket. "You feel a grip coming on this winter, you come to me. You buy a bottle of the Golden Grip from a man who reads. You don't go begging weeds off a widow who guesses." And this time they really laughed. The whole hall of them. It rolled and it built the way a crowd's laughter does, feeding on itself, everyone glad it was not them being laughed at. Della was in the room. She was near the door, where she always was. She did not argue. Della never argued. She simply went to the side table and she gathered up her jars, one by one, into her basket. And in the awful noise of that laughter she turned and walked out, straight-backed, chin level, and let the door fall shut behind her. But one person in that hall did not laugh. Near the front stood a girl of 22, Ruth Pike, with a baby on her hip. Her boy Samuel, not yet 2, fat-cheeked and sleeping against her neck. Ruth had a young, tired, tender face. And she did not laugh at Elias Crane's joke. She watched the widow gather her jars in the noise. She watched her walk out alone. And something turned over in Ruth Pike's chest, something she could not have named, watching that straight back go through that door. She would remember it. When the time came, she would remember it. That should have been the end of it. A cruel joke at a party. Towns do worse. But Elias Crane was not a man to leave a thing half done. And he had a board to sit on. 3 days later, the town health board met in the Grange Hall, and Crane presided, and the matter on the table was Della Ashby. "I want you to see this room, because it is the worst thing the town does, and it is the last thing it does before the world turns on it." Lamps hung low. Men along the front bench, Crane at the center, the banker, the storekeep, 2 of the deacons. Folding chairs behind, half full of townsfolk come to watch. And at the very back, standing, because no one offered her a chair, Della Ashby. Somebody had told her to come. That was a courtesy of a kind. To let the accused hear it read out. So she came, in her dark dress, and she stood at the back with her hands folded, and she watched. Crane read it from a paper. He'd had it drawn up proper. Whereas the practice of medicine by unlicensed persons endangered the public health of the county. whereas the dispensing of untested remedies by such persons risked the lives of the citizenry, and the young especial. Be it therefore resolved that the Health Board of Harmon's Crossing did forbid the said Della Ashby from selling, giving, trading, or in any wise dispensing any remedy, medicine, tonic, salve, or physic within the limits of the township, on pain of the law. He read it in a fine, grave, public-spirited voice, as though it cost him something to protect them all from this danger in their midst. And then he called for a show of hands. And the hands went up. Not all at once. There was a beat where nobody wanted to be first. And then the banker raised his, because Crane held his note. And then a deacon, because the banker had. And then it went around the room the way the plates had gone down the supper table, each hand pulling up the next, until the whole front of the Grange Hall was a field of raised arms, 40 of them, forbidding a widow from doing the one kind thing she did in this world. Crane counted them with satisfaction. Carried, he said. And at the back of the hall, Della Ashby unfolded her hands. She looked, for one moment, at all those raised arms. She looked at Verna Sloane, sitting straight in the second row, her hand up with the rest, her chin high with the rightness of it. And then Della turned, and she opened the door, and she went out into the cold, and the door shut on the warm and righteous light. She walked home the long dark mile to the Ferris cabin. She built up her fire. And for a long time she stood in the middle of her own front room, very still. And then she raised her eyes to the high shelf, to the worn leather bag, to the brass clasp, and the 2 letters stamped in the hide. Her hand rose partway toward it. It hung there in the firelight. And then it dropped. And she turned away and put out the lamp and went to bed. She had not been asked. That was the whole of it. Nobody had asked her. So the bag stayed on the shelf. Now the town had what it wanted. The granny woman was shut up in her cabin at the edge of things, forbidden, finished, put in her place. Harmon's Crossing had drawn its line clean and voted it into law, and for about 2 weeks the town was very pleased with itself. Then the Dooley boy got sick. It was the same little one Della had brought through a fever the winter before, only bigger now, a boy of 4. It started like a cold. A runny nose, a cough, a warmth to the forehead. His mother gave him what everybody gave, a spoon of Crane's golden grippy tonic, and he went warm and quiet, and she thought he was mending. By the second day his fever was so high he did not know her. His eyes were bright and far away, and his little chest worked like a bellows, quick and shallow, and his lips had a color lips should not have. And no cool tea came, no windows opened, no quick sure hands in the dark, because the woman who did those things was forbidden by law, and the boy's father was a man who'd raised his hand at the health board and would not now be made a fool. So they gave him more tonic, and the alcohol in it dried him, and the fever climbed, and on the 3rd night the Dooley boy died. 4 years old. In a town that had voted, 2 weeks before, to keep the one person who might have saved him away from its children, for their own protection. And then the Pruitt girl took sick. And the 2 children at the Haas farm. And a man down at the mill. It moved from house to house faster than a cold has any business moving, faster than anything the older folks could remember. House to house along the road like fire in dry grass. Crane had a name for it. He stood behind his glass counter and told them it was the autumn grip. A seasonal complaint, nothing to fret over for a strong constitution. And he sold them the golden grippy tonic by the case, 75 cents a bottle, warm and sweet and sure. And it did to the whole town what it had done to the Dooley boy. It made the fevered feel mended while it dried them out from the inside. It filled the graveyard on the hill by the handful. But it was not the autumn grip. It had a truer name, and one person in that county knew it on sight, and she was shut up in a leaning cabin at the edge of town, forbidden to speak it. The influenza had come back. The same great sickness that had walked the earth the year before and killed the young and the strong in a single hard week, the sickness that had taken soldiers in their cots before ever they reached the war. It was making its autumn round again. And it had found a town that had just, by a show of 40 hands, thrown away its one defense. They sent a rider for the doctor. The only real physician for the whole county was Dr. Whitfield, and he was at Fallon City, 3 days' hard ride over the ridges to the southeast. 3 days there. A day to gather himself, if he could come at all, if he was not buried in sick of his own. 3 days back. 6 days, at the least, likely more. And the influenza was killing a healthy man in 3. So the rider went, pounding out of Harmon's Crossing at first light, carrying the town's plea over the hills. And behind him the fever climbed cabin to cabin, and Crane sold his tonic, and the graves went up on the hill, and the whole town began, slowly, to understand the size of the thing it had let in. And the doctor was 6 days off. And the one who could help was a mile up the road, forbidden, silent, waiting, up at the Ferris cabin, Della knew. Of course she knew. You cannot keep a plague secret in a town that small. She heard it in the church bell tolling too often. She saw it in the smoke from too many chimneys burning through the night. She saw a wagon go by on the road with a small pine box in the bed and a man walking beside it with his hat in his hands. She knew exactly what was moving through Harmon's Crossing. She had seen it before. She had seen 1,000 cases of it. She knew what it was, and she knew what it would do, and she knew, almost to the hour, how it would go. And she did not come down the hill. Understand her now. This is the hardest thing to understand about Della Ashby, and it is the truest. She had been forbidden. By law, by a show of hands, by the whole town's will. She had been laughed at in the Grange Hall and shunned at the supper table and voted a danger to the county's children. And she was not a woman who forced herself on anyone. She had never in her life pushed her help where it was not wanted. She would not start now. They had told her, as plain as a town can tell a soul, to stay away. So she stayed away. She kept her fire. She kept her silence. She waited. But that night she took the bag down. She stood on a chair and lifted it from the high shelf, and she set it on the table. And she wiped the dust from the leather with her apron. The brass clasp. The 2 letters, T.A., and she opened it. There was no junk inside. No old rags, no dried-up bottles, nothing a granny woman scrapes together. Inside that worn leather bag, wrapped in clean flannel, laid in their fitted places, were instruments. Forceps that gleamed. A slender glass thermometer in a velvet slot. A roll of catgut suture. A scalpel, a stethoscope, coiled neat, scissors and probes and clamps, each one clean, each one cared for, each one bright. And every steel piece of it was stamped, small, near the handle, with an emblem. The emblem of the United States Army Nurse Corps. And folded in the lid, in an oilcloth sleeve, was a certificate, a service record. A name written in a fine official hand. Not Corporal Thomas Ashby, hers, Della Ashby of the Army Nurse Corps, who had served the influenza wards of a base hospital through the worst of it, who had nursed the dying by the 100 when the fever came the first time, who had held the line in a ward of the drowning when there were more cots than there were breaths to fill them. It had never been Tom's bag. Tom had only carried it home. It came back from the war in his place, because she'd been discharged sick herself, and he'd carried her kit ahead of her, and then he'd caught the fever in that same hospital and died of it, and the bag had come home, and she had come home after it, a widow, to his town. And she had never once told a living soul in Harmon's Crossing what her hands knew. The audience knows now. You know now, before the town does. The granny woman with the weeds and the jars, the danger the health board voted against, the joke of the autumn social, she was a battlefield nurse. She had fought this exact fever, in its worst year, in a hospital full of the dying, and won more of them back than anyone had a right to. She knew every hour of what was walking through Harmon's Crossing. She knew how to fight it. She had the tools laid open on her table in the firelight. And still she did not go down the hill. Because no one had asked. She closed the bag. She set it, this time, not up on the high shelf but down by the door. Where a person leaves the thing they mean to carry. and she sat down by her fire, and she folded her hands, and she waited, the way she had waited at the supper table, the way she had waited at the back of the health board. She waited to be asked. And out in the dark the fever climbed, and the doctor rode, and the town buried its children by the 75-cent bottle. It was the 4th night since the rider left when the knock came. It was not a knock, really, it was a pounding. Fists on wood, out of the dead middle of the night, frantic, the sound of someone who has run the whole dark mile and has nothing left. Della was awake. She had not been sleeping much. She rose, and she took the lamp, and she opened her door. Ruth Pike stood on the step. Alone, her hair loose and wild, no shawl against the cold, her chest heaving. And in her arms, wrapped in a blanket, was her boy. Little Samuel, not yet 2, the fat-cheeked baby who had slept against her neck at the autumn social. He was not sleeping now. He hung limp in her arms. His face was the color of ash, and his breath came in small tearing pulls, and he burned so hot that Della could feel the heat of him from a foot away, coming off the child like off a stove. Ruth could barely speak. The words came broken. Nobody would come. The doctor was gone. Crane had shut his door. Her own mother had told her the boy was in God's hands now. And she had thought, she had remembered, the woman who walked out of the Grange Hall with her back straight while the whole town laughed. And she had wrapped her dying son in a blanket and run a mile in the dark on the strength of a straight back and a memory to pound on a forbidden door. "Please." Ruth got out. "Please." "They said you can't. They said it's against the law." "I don't care. Please. He's all I've got." Della Ashby looked at the child. One look. She saw the ash color, and the tearing breath, and the way the small chest pulled. And something moved behind her steady eyes, something old and sure and terrible in its calm. She did not say a word about the health board. She did not say, "I told you so," or "Where were you at the supper," or now you come to my door." She said none of the things she had every right in the world to say. She reached down by the door and lifted the leather bag by its worn handle, and she looked at Ruth Pike, and she said only 4 words, in a low, even voice, already stepping out into the cold. "Boil every pot of water you have." And she pulled the door shut behind her, and went down the dark road toward the town that had shunned her, carrying her husband's bag that had never been his, walking fast, walking sure, into the sickness she alone knew the name of. They had begun to beg at her door. It had begun. And the town of Harmon's Crossing had no idea yet what had just walked back down the hill toward it in the dark. The Pike cabin sat low against the creek, one lamp burning in the window like a coal that would not catch. Ruth had run on ahead, the boy in her arms, and by the time Della came through the door, the girl was on her knees by the bed, rocking, saying his name over and over like it might hold him down to the earth. Della set the bag on the table. She did not hurry, and she did not waste a motion. She unpinned her shawl and laid it on a chair. Then she looked at the boy. Samuel Pike was not yet 2 years old. His lips had gone the color of a bruise. Each breath pulled the skin in above his little collarbones, and the air came out of him with a wet crackle, like a wheel turning in mud. "How many pots on the fire?" Della said. "2, Ruth whispered. 3, if you count the kettle. Count the kettle. Fill them all." She rolled her sleeves to the elbow. She opened the brass clasp of the bag, and the lamplight fell on things that had no business in a granny woman's kitchen. Steel, a glass tube of quicksilver, a curved needle in a fold of oilcloth. Ruth saw it and did not understand it, and did not stop to try. Della laid the flat of her hand on the boy's chest. She bent her ear to his mouth. She counted, her lips moving, her eyes on the far wall, and the count told her more than an hour of talk would have. "This is the fever that's in the town," Della said. "It isn't grip. Whatever the druggist calls it, it isn't grip." "What is it?" Ruth said. "Influenza." She said the word plain and flat, the way you'd name a man you'd fought. I've nursed 1,000 of these. More, it doesn't kill with heat. It fills the lungs and drowns them dry land. That's what's happening to your boy right now. The water's rising in him. Ruth made a sound. Don't, Della said, not unkind. Don't spend it on grief. I need your hands. The tonic sat on the sill, a squat brown bottle, Crane's Golden Grippy Tonic, 75 cents and a paper label with a rooster crowing. Ruth had spent money she didn't have on it. Della picked it up, pulled the cork, smelled it once. Alcohol and quinine and sugar water. She poured it out the door into the dark. That's been drying him worse, she said. Bring me the boiled water when it cools to warm. And salt. She worked the rest of that night the way a smith works iron, steady and without pause. She stripped the sweated bedding off him and had Ruth carry it out to burn, every stitch, the whole soaked bundle of it going up in the yard while the frost came down. She threw the window open 2 hands width. Ruth flinched at the cold air, for the whole town believed a fevered child should be sealed up warm as an oven, and Della said only, he needs air more than he needs a blanket. Trust me or send me home. Ruth trusted her. Della dribbled the salt water between the boy's lips a spoon at a time, patient as dropping seed. She steeped willow bark till the water ran bitter and brown, and she got that into him too. She propped him up on a rolled quilt so the fluid in his chest would settle low and leave the top of the lung to breathe. All night she turned him, a quarter turn every little while, so no part of him lay drowning. By the gray of morning the boy's lips had gone from bruise color to pink. The tearing pull above his collarbone had eased. He slept. And it was true sleep, not the sick stupor. His forehead, when Ruth laid her mouth to it, was warm. Only warm. Like a child's ought to be. Ruth began to cry then, at last, and Della let her. 5th day is the danger, Della said, wiping her instruments. He may turn again. Watch his breath, not his skin. If the breath goes fast and shallow and his lips blue, you send for me at a run, day or dark, ban or no ban. You'd come, Ruth said. After everything, you'd come. Della latched the bag. I already came, she said. She meant to slip home before the town woke, but a town at the edge of dying does not sleep, and it has eyes. Ruth's neighbor had watched the bedding burn in the yard. Ruth's neighbor had a girl of her own gone hot and glassy 2 doors down. By the middle of that morning the word was moving cabin to cabin the way the fever itself moved, only faster, because hope travels quicker than sickness. The granny woman had pulled the pike boy back. The granny woman knew a thing the tonic didn't. They came to her the second day in 2s and 3s, hats in their hands, the same men and women who had carried their plates down the church table. A father came whose daughter had not kept water down in 3 days. His name was Hollis, and he had voted, Della knew, in the lamplit hall to forbid her. He stood on her step and could not look at her. They say you helped the Pikes, he said. I did. My girl won't drink. Whatever she takes comes back up. Crane says keep dosing her, but she's drying up in front of me, getting smaller. The tonic's doing that, Della said. It pulls the water out of her faster than her fever does. Stop it. Salt and clean water, warm, a spoon at a time, all day and all night. And boil everything her mouth touches. You'd come look at her. Della took the bag off the shelf. She looked at Hollis, at the band he'd raised his hand for, and she said nothing about it. There was too much work ahead to waste breath being right. She followed him home. The Hollis girl was 6 and hollow-eyed, her skin tenting up when Della pinched the back of her small hand, the mark staying pinched. The surest sign there was almost nothing left in her. Crane's tonic sat on the dresser, near empty. The girl had been dosed loyally into the grave. Watch, Della said. She wet the girl's lips first, only that, and waited. Then a half-spoon of salt water, and waited. Then another. She did not flood the child. She fed her a drop at a time the way you'd fill a cracked cup, letting each sip settle before the next. It took an hour to get down what a healthy child gulps in a swallow. But it stayed. By noon the girl asked, in a thread of a voice, for more. Hollis stood against the wall with his fist against his mouth and watched his daughter keep water down for the first time in 3 days. He was a hard man, and he did not weep easy. But he wept then, silently, into his own knuckles. "Why?" he said, when Della was packing to go. "Why'd you come?" "After the meeting." "After I boil her cups," Della said. "And her spoons. And your own hands before you touch her. That's all I need from you." She would not take the thanks, and she would not take the apology, and after a while the men stopped trying to give her either, because she had made it plain that there was no room in the day for it. There was only the work, and the work spread out from the pike cabin like a light spreads from a struck match, one dark house at a time. By the 4th day the town could not pretend anymore. The fever was in a dozen houses. 2 more had died, an old man out past the mill, and the Dooley baby's little sister, gone before anyone thought to send for the granny woman. Because the town had spent a week ashamed to ask. Della heard of that one, and her jaw set, and she said, "Lo," to Ruth, who was her shadow now, and her runner, "No more of that. No more dying because they're too proud to knock. We bring them together. I can't run a mile between every cot." The Grange Hall stood empty at the middle of town, the same hall where the health board had voted her silent. Della walked into it in the gray of the 4th morning and stood in the middle of the plank floor and turned in a slow circle, and Ruth saw her measuring it the way a general measures ground. "Here," Della said. "We bring the sick here. Rows down each wall. Boil the linens in the yard. 1 door in, 1 door out. The well's close. It'll do." "They won't let you," Ruth said. "Crane presides here." "The board, then let them come and stop me," Della said. "I'll be too busy to notice." Nobody came to stop her. There was no one left with the stomach for it. They carried the sick in on doors and in wagon beds, and Della laid them out in rows the way she had laid out men in a base hospital in a year she never spoke of, the worst year. The year the same fever had come through the wards like a scythe, and she had learned it breath by breath, death by death, until she knew its every turn. She had Ruth boil the linens till the yard steamed. She marked each cot with a slip of paper and a number, and on each slip she wrote the fever and the breath count morning and night in a neat hand. So she could see at a glance who was climbing and who was falling. She ran a triage no one in Harmon's Crossing had a word for. The ones who would live without her, she left to Ruth and the mothers. The ones already too far gone, she made easy and did not waste the hours she didn't have. And the ones in the balance, the ones who would live or die on whether a trained hand reached them in time. Those she took herself, and she did not leave their side until they'd turned. There was a man named Alton whose lungs had gone to pneumonia, the fever's second act, the drowning proper. He lay on his back and could not clear what filled him. Crane, if he'd been dosed by Crane, would have been kept flat and warm and given the rooster tonic and left to fill up like a sinking boat. Della had him propped near sitting, tilted, so the bad lung drained low. She built a poultice, ground mustard and flour in a cloth, hot as the skin would bear, and laid it on his chest to pull the blood forward and loosen what was packed in him. She pounded his back with her cupped hands in a rhythm, turning him, working the muck up out of him, cough by cough. It was ugly work, and it went on for hours. But Alton breathed. By the 2nd day of it, Alton sat up on his own and asked for broth, and the men who'd carried him in dead certain gaped at him like he'd come up out of a grave. "How'd you know to do that?" one of them asked her. "The pounding, the propping. None of us ever. I've done it 10,000 times. Della said, and turned to the next cot, and the man stood there, with the number of it ringing in his ears. 10,000. Where does a granny woman get 10,000? The town began to understand that it had been wrong about something, though it did not yet know the size of the wrong. Crane understood it fastest and hated it most. His counter had gone quiet. The brown bottles sat in their rows, and no one bought them. And the 75 cents that had come to him in a steady trickle all autumn had dried up the same week the granny woman set up her cots. He came to the door of the Grange Hall on the 5th day, and stood there in his good coat, and looked at the rows of the sick, and said, "Loud enough to carry. This is quackery. This is exactly what the board forbade. Unlicensed doctoring. When the fever passes, she'll be answerable for every soul that dies under her hand." Nobody answered him. A woman spooning water into her son didn't even look up. That was worse than any argument, that silence, and Crane felt it, and his face went a mottled red. "You'll see," he said. "Mark me. You'll see." What they saw was this. A man named Pruitt, Old Man Pruitt, whose leg Della had saved from the saw a year back. Though the town had forgotten that too, old Pruitt's brother had been dosed by Crane from the first, faithful to the tonic, 3 bottles of it, and had never once been brought to the Grange Hall because Crane had told the family the widow's methods were dangerous. And on the 5th day, the danger day, the brother drowned in his own bed with a near-empty bottle of Golden Grip tonic on the nightstand and the rooster crowing on the label. When they carried him past the Grange Hall to the churchyard, the whole town saw the bottle still clutched in the dead man's hand, because his fingers had stiffened around it. And every soul who'd bought one went home and looked at their own bottle a little differently. Crane felt the ground move under him that day. But he did not fall yet. Pride holds a man up long after the floor is gone. The crisis came on the 6th night, and it came, as these things do, to the proudest door in town. Verna Sloane was 60 years old and had been president of the Ladies' Aid Society for 11 years, and it was Verna Sloane who had quietly struck Della Ashby's name off every list. Verna, who had led the plates down the church table one by one. She had a granddaughter, Clara, 6 years old, gold-haired, the light of the old woman's whole hard life. And on the 6th night, Clara stopped breathing. They came for Della at a dead run, 2 of Verna's kin, pounding on the Grange Hall's own doors, though Della was already inside, already 3 nights without sleep, gray in the face, moving cot to cot on will alone. "The Sloane child," they gasped. "She's gone blue. She's gone still." "Verna's, you have to." Della was already moving. She took the bag and she ran, and for a woman of 49, 3 days without sleep, she ran like something 20 years younger. Because a child gone blue is a clock with one hand left. The Sloane house was the finest in town, and it did not matter at all. Clara lay in a white bed in a white room, and she was the color of skim milk gone bad, her lips dark, her small chest still. Verna Sloane knelt beside her, and the proud straight back was broken all the way down, and she was making a sound Della had heard in field wards and had never gotten used to. The sound a person makes when the thing they cannot survive is happening in front of them. Della did not stop to be gentle. She swept the child flat, tipped her head, cleared her mouth with a hooked finger. A plug of thick matter came away, the thing that had sealed the small airway shut. Then she put her own mouth over the child's mouth and nose and breathed. A small breath, the right size for a small chest. She watched the ribs. They rose. She took her mouth away and let them fall. She breathed again. And again. Slow, even, patient as she'd been patient with everything, refusing to hurry even now, because panic kills more than the fever does. Verna knelt with her hands twisted in her own skirt and watched the widow she had shunned breathe life into her granddaughter, breath by borrowed breath. It went on so long that the kin at the door gave up hope. It went on past the point where a person is supposed to keep trying. Della did not keep time by hope. She kept time by the pulse under her 2 fingers on the child's neck. And while that flickered, she would not stop. And it flickered, so she did not stop. And then Clara coughed. She coughed, and gagged, and drew a breath of her own, a whooping, ragged, furious breath, and her arms came up, and she began to cry. Thin and high and alive, the most beautiful ugly sound in the world. The dark drained out of her lips like a tide going out. Pink came up under the skim milk skin. Della sat back on her heels. Her hands were shaking now that they were allowed to. She was so tired the room swam. Verna Sloane gathered the screaming, living child against her chest and rocked her and could not speak for a long while. When she could, she did not look at Della like a president of anything. She looked at her like a beggar. "Why?" Verna said. Her voice came apart on the word. "Why would you help us? After what we did to you. I struck your name off. I led them down the table. Why would you?" Della got herself to her feet, one hand on the bedpost. She looked down at the old woman and the saved child, and she was too tired for anger and had never had much use for it anyway. "I never asked you to believe me," Della said. "Quiet, even. I only asked you to boil the water." And she picked up the bag, and she went back to the Grange Hall, where there were 11 more cots, and the 6th day was not over. Word of the Sloane child ran through the town before dawn. If Verna Sloane, who had led the shunning, now sat at the widow's feet, then it was finished. The last pretending was done. Harmon's Crossing gave itself over to the granny woman entirely, and the dying slowed, and then it stopped, house by house, cot by cot, as her methods took hold in every home. Dr. Whitfield rode in on the morning of the 7th day. He came in off the Fallon City Road on a horse ridden near to death, 3 days out in a hard push, and he came braced for a slaughterhouse. He had heard, from the rider, of a county fever with no doctor and no medicine, and a fool woman doing kitchen doctoring in a Grange Hall, and he expected to find bodies stacked and a town on its knees. He was a county physician, and he had seen the influenza do its work the year before, and he knew what a town looks like when it loses this fight. He tied his horse and pushed open the Grange Hall doors and stopped dead on the threshold. What he saw was order. Rows of cots down each wall, spaced clean and even. Linens boiled white and changed. A slip of paper pinned to each cot with a number and a fever chart in a neat hand, morning and night. Windows open the right amount. The sick propped at the right angle. Broth going down. And more than half the cots holding people sitting up. Weak and hollowed out but plainly mending. People who, by every measure he carried in his head, should have been in the churchyard. He walked the rows slow, disbelieving, reading the charts. He picked up a slip and read the breath counts and the fever line and the note beneath it, 5th day past, lungs draining, watch for relapse, and he set it down like it might break. This was not folk work. This was field triage. This was a base hospital run in an Ozark Grange Hall by one pair of hands. "Who?" he said to the room. "Who's running this?" Ruth Pike, red-eyed, still on her feet after 7 days, pointed to the far corner. Della Ashby had finally sat down. The last fever had broken an hour before, and she had lowered herself into a plain chair by the window and fallen asleep sitting up. Her chin dropped, her hands loose in her lap for the first time in a week. The leather bag stood open on the floor beside her. Dr. Whitfield crossed the hall. He looked at the sleeping woman, at the gray in her hair and the plain worn face and the oil-dark hands. And then he looked at the open bag. He knelt. He lifted out an instrument, a pair of forceps, steel gone soft silver with use, and he turned it to the light, and on the shank he found a small stamped emblem. He knew that emblem. He had seen it on the instruments of the women who had held the wards together in the worst year of his life. Army Nurse Corps. His hands were not quite steady. He reached into the lid of the bag and drew out the folded oilcloth sleeve, and inside it the certificate, the service record, the name written out in full and the years of it, and the base hospital and the fever wards, all of it. The whole hidden history of the granny woman of Harmon's Crossing. He read it twice. Then he closed it, and he stood, and he turned to the door of the Grange Hall, where the town had crowded in behind him, 40 of them, the whole of Harmon's Crossing, drawn by the doctors coming, packed shoulder to shoulder to hear the verdict of the qualified man. Dr. Whitfield held up the certificate so it caught the gray morning light. "You had a battlefield nurse living among you," he said, and he did not raise his voice, because he did not have to. The hall had gone silent as a held breath. "For a year. A trained Army Nurse Corps nurse who served the influenza wards in the war, the worst wards there were. She has treated this fever the way it is treated in the great hospitals. She has done here, alone, with boiled water and willow bark and her own 2 hands, what I could not have done faster with a wagon full of medicine." He looked around at the faces. "You called her a granny woman," he said. "You forbade her to help you. And she saved your children anyway." The truth landed on 40 faces at once. You could watch it go through the crowd like wind through a wheat field, head after head bowing under it. The plates carried down the table, the laughter at the autumn social, the show of hands in the lamplit hall. Every soul in Harmon's Crossing stood in the wreck of what they had done, and there was no place to look but at the sleeping woman in the chair. Della had woken at the sound of her own history read aloud. She did not stand, and she did not speak. She only sat, her hands in her lap, and let it be over. Elias Crane pushed forward through the crowd. He had lost his trade and lost his face, and a man like that will make one last grab at solid ground. "She has no license," he said, loud, jabbing a finger at the certificate. "Whatever she did in the war, she is not a licensed physician in this county. The board forbade her practice, and that stands. She has broken the law in this very hall, doctor, and you as a professional man should, a license," Dr. Whitfield said. He crossed to Crane. He was still holding the service papers. He held them up in one hand, and in the other he lifted a slip of cot paper off the nearest bed. "You want to talk law," Whitfield said. "Let's talk about what you dosed these people with." He looked down the row. "I've walked these cots. I've read her notes. The ones who came in worst are the ones who drank the most of your tonic, alcohol and quinine, sold at 75 cents to fevered people it dried out from the inside. You didn't just fail to help them, Crane, you hurried them along. I can name you 3 graves this week that your bottle helped dig, and I'll say so to the county if you'd like me to." Crane's mouth was open. Nothing came out of it. "Your license," Whitfield said, quieter now, "is to sell soap and headache powders. You are not a doctor and you never were. This woman is closer to one than you will be if you live to be 100. Crane stood there. His finger was still half raised, and slowly it came down. Then a thing happened that no one planned. A neighbor, Hollis, whose girl had kept the water down, walked to the wall of the Grange Hall where a case of the tonic had been stacked for sale, and he took a bottle off the top, and he carried it out the door and set it down in the dust outside. He didn't smash it. He just set it down, out of the room, gentle and final. And then another man did the same. And a woman. And a boy carrying his mother's bottle from home. One after another they carried the brown bottles out into the morning and stood them in a row in the dust until there was not one left in the hall, and Crane's whole trade sat abandoned in the road with the rooster crowing on every label at nobody. Crane watched it happen. He did not say another word. He turned and went out through the crowd, and the crowd parted to let him pass. And no hand touched him, and no voice cursed him, which was the worst thing they could have done. He walked out into a town that had simply stopped believing him, and that was the whole of his fall, dry and quiet and complete. Verna Sloane came last. She had Clara on her hip, the child pale but bright-eyed, one small fist knotted in her grandmother's collar. Verna walked the length of the Grange Hall, past all the cots, past all the townsfolk, to the plain chair by the window where Della sat. The whole town watched the president of the Ladies' Aid cross to the widow she had exiled. There was a long table down the center of that hall, the same kind of table the plates had been carried down at the church supper a season ago. Verna Sloane looked at it. Then she set Clara down, and she took up a chair, and she carried it herself, 60 years old, the child clinging to her skirt, and she set it down at Della Ashby's end of the table. And she sat in it. At the widow's end. In front of the whole town. "I don't ask you to forgive it," Verna said. "I wouldn't. But I'll sit here. From now on, I'll sit here." Della looked at her a long moment. Then she nodded. Once. And that was all, and it was enough. Ruth Pike came and stood at Della's shoulder, where she had stood for 7 days, and did not move, and everyone in that hall understood without a word that the girl was the widow's now, her apprentice, her shadow, the one she would teach. The fever passed out of Harmon's crossing that week the way weather passes. It had come like judgment, and it went like weather, and when it was gone it had taken the town's old idea of itself with it and left something quieter and truer in its place. Spring came up green over the Ozark hills. The Grange Hall did not go back to being a Grange Hall. The county made it a clinic, the first the district ever had, and it was Della Ashby's, though she never once called it hers. Morning light came through the tall windows onto scrubbed pine floors. A willow at the window had just come into leaf, thin green against the glass. The place smelled of boiled linen and coffee, and the linen was always boiling, because that had turned out to be the whole secret, or near enough, and the town had learned it the hard way and would not forget it. On a shelf by the door stood a worn leather bag with a brass clasp, wiped clean, the letters T.A. still pressed faint into the leather. Della stood at the long table one spring morning with Ruth Pike beside her, and she held a glass thermometer up to the light and showed the girl how to read the thin silver line. Ruth was quick. Ruth had been quick from the first night. "Shake it down hard," Della said. "Under the tongue. Wait the full 3 minutes, no cheating. The number doesn't lie, but a rushed reading does." Ruth read it back to her, and got it right, and Della almost smiled. Elias Crane still kept his store. He sold soap now, and stamps, and needles, and thread, and no tonic, for there was no one left to buy it, and he had stopped pretending there ever should have been. When Della passed his window that spring on her way to the clinic, he raised his hand to the brim of his hat and tipped it to her, stiff, correct, saying nothing. And Della nodded back, once, and said nothing either, and that was the whole of what passed between them from that day on, and both of them found it was enough. Verna Sloane came to the clinic door that same morning with an armful of fresh linens, folded square, and Clara skipping at her side with color high in her cheeks and no memory at all of the night she had gone blue. "The Ladies' Aid meets here Thursdays now," Verna said, "if you'll have us. We thought we could keep the linens boiled, roll the bandages, whatever's wanted." Della took the folded linens from her arms. "Bring the water hot," she said. And Verna Sloane laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and said she would. So this is the end of it. And here is the thing worth carrying home from a story like this one. A whole town looked at a quiet woman with a soft voice and dirt on her hands and decided it knew exactly what she was worth. It sorted her below the loud men in their good coats, below the license and the ledger and the rooster on the bottle. And the quietest pair of hands in that town had already carried more death and more mercy through the worst year the world had ever seen than all the loud men in it put together, and had never said a word about it, because respect that has to announce itself was never worth much to her anyway. That spring, when the clinic was running and the willow was full out and green, Della Ashby reached up and took the leather bag down off its shelf. She wiped the brass clasp once more with her thumb, though it was already clean, and she put it into Ruth Pike's 2 hands, the way a thing is passed to someone who has earned it. Ruth held it and did not understand. "It was your husband's," she said. "Tom's bag." "I couldn't. It was never his," Della said. She looked at the letters pressed into the leather, T.A., that everyone in town had read one way for a year, and she let the girl in on the small true thing at the bottom of all of it. "He only carried it home for me. Both our initials fit the same 2 letters. That was the joke of it, between us. It was mine all along, and it's yours now. Fill it, use it up. That's what it's for." And Ruth Pike took the bag, and the willow moved a little at the window, and the water was already coming to a boil in the next room. If this story reached you, tell me the town you're watching from. I always want to see how far a story like this one travels.